Warmly welcome again, everybody. I'm Cecilia Åsberg. I'm a professor of gender nature culture at Linköping University and director of the Posthumanities Hub. And we are today having this amazing webinar, the Somatics of Resistance, with Bigé and Erin Manning, introduced and curated by Ombre Tarragona. Now, my dears, you're wondering, who is this Ombre? I always try to embarrass Ombre when I can. So Ombre Tarragona is a PhD student in gender studies and philosophy at Université Paris 8, Vincent Saint-Denis. Did I say that right? Ish? Yeah. Okay, good. So their doctoral research explores the intersection of neurodiversity and animality. It examines the co-construction of autism and animality, exploring the relationship between autistic people and non-human animals, and offers an animal framework for neurodiversity with the concepts of ethodiversity and ethodivergence. But that's not all, my dears. This term we've had the great pleasure of having Ombre in our midst, on location here in Sweden. So for those of you Swedish-speaking people in the audience, remember that Ombre also speaks Swedish. I think that is just telling of how multi-talented Ombre is. Now, without further ado, Ombre, have I done enough of, putting some rouge on your cheeks?
Yes, enough and too much. But
I'm
thank you
done.
very
My
much.
work here is done. And I give the floor to you.
Thank you. So thanks, Ceci, for organizing. I'm going to be presenting our two speakers today, giving you some information about the schedule, the timeline of the event, and then we'll get going. So I'll present our speakers, introduce our speakers in the order of presentation, starting with Emma Bigé, who you might see probably, and for me, or on the top right, but yeah. So Emma is a doctor of philosophy, a dancer, and a curator. Emma studies, writes, but also translates texts in between fields such as dance studies, trans studies, and environmental and humanities. In 2023, Emma published Mouvementement, éco-politique de la danse, a book that will soon be translated into English with the title A Queer and Blessed Unrest on the Eco-Politics of Dancing. And that's an extract of this book that I think you'll be reading us today, Emma. This year, Emma has co-published, or recently, actually very recently, co-published Eco-Transfeminisms for the French press Les Liens qui Libèrent. Emma also teaches epistemology and queer studies in art and dance schools. And as she likes to say, the rest of the time, she lives on the edge of a forest, and whenever she can, she rolls around the grounds. And we then have Erin Manning, who you also probably see on the top of your screens. Erin is a professor at Concordia University in Montreal, in Canada. She is the founder of Sense Lab, a laboratory that explores the intersections between art practice and philosophy through the matrix of the sensing body and movement. In 2020, Erin published for Pragmatics of the Useless with Duke University Press, a book that was interested in Black studies and neurodiversity. Before that, Erin had published different books, also at the intersection of neurodiversity, process philosophy, but also gesture and dance studies. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the minor gesture and always more than one individuations dance. Maybe we'll talk about them as well today. Um, and this year, in September, I think Erin's new book, The Being of Relation, will be out with the University of Chicago Press. I think, if I understood correctly, this book is a bit of a continuation of the thinking that you initiated with the Pragmatics of the Useless. And this is what you'll be presenting or telling us about today. So some information about the timeline for today. We'll have our two presentations by Emma and Erin, um, which might, I guess, leave us around four ish, maybe a bit before, maybe after. We'll have a short comfort break for everyone to be able to refresh 5-10 minutes, we'll see. And then we'll have a moment for conversations, discussion, Q&A, maybe first between each other as presenters and organizers, but we could also directly open to the audience if everyone is jumping on their chairs with many questions. Um, so that leaves us around 5. That's the theoretical time when we stop, but again, this is flexible. I think this is about it. As Sissy said, we're trying to do this in a open, flexible way, accessible way. So feel free to move, grab a snack, water, just yeah, bring movement into the presentation into Zoom. So I think we'll start with you, Emma, if you're ready. You have shared the PDF of the text that you're going to read, so I'll share it as well for those of you who might want to be able to follow by reading as well. So let me try and find it as Emma starts.
Thank you, Ombre, and thank you for the Posthumanities Center for hosting. I'm really honored to be speaking today together with all of you and Erin in particular. The book that you referred to, I wrote in the same time as I was translating Always More Than One by Erin Manning, which is soon going to come out in French at the Presse Universitaire de France. So it makes a lot of sense that I'm now getting to read the English version that just got translated in your presence, Erin. Just a word to say in the spirit of what Ombre just said, that, I mean, traditionally, looking at the person who is speaking is a technology that is used to pay attention, but it's not the only tradition that's available. If it's more supportive to be rolling on the ground or looking at the ceiling or doing all sorts of stuff with fidgety things, you are welcome to do it. And of course, if you need to interrupt anything, that's also very much welcome, even though we're gonna both read from texts that are written. And a more general situation for the text that I'm going to read from, it's in the middle of the book, but it's pretty much understandable. And the book is dedicated to what some dancers and theorists of dance have been calling the nanopolitics of movement, meaning looking at how not only the micropolitical level, the way we relate to each other, not only the macropolitical level, the way state, superstructure inform our movements, but also the nanopolitics of the way we relate to ourselves and to our environment are at stake in building up for other worlds. And so the book is a sort of inquiry in different gestures that put these nanopolitics at the center. And for the chapter that we will read, the gesture that is centered is the one that could be called touching or being touched, or a sort of in between those two, which ended up being called contact zones. So here I go. Some of you have the chapter and you can follow with that. Contact zones. And the first section is called ecotones. How would we describe that place where we allow ourselves to meet one another? When a gesture causes epidermises to graze past each other and masses to collide, what histories, what geographies, what ancestralities, what asymmetries of power are brought into play? In decolonial studies, there is a term used to describe the spaces where people, species, and histories converge, meet, and find themselves inventing novel forms of communication. They are called contact zones. Derived from the concept of contact language, contact zones refer to the lingua franca that emerges in the buffer zones between colonizers and colonized, often ports or pioneer towns. The term contact zones underscores the fact that the influence is always mutual, regardless of existing power imbalances. As oppressive as it is, the colonial world continues to be affected by the nature cultures it claims to occupy, and that it circumscribes into serving its own extractivist projects. Indeed, one of the defining features of the colonial discourse is that its narratives seek to disappear the agency of indigenous peoples in their brutal encounter with the settler colonial forces of occupation. And it has been one of the primary undertakings of anti-colonial research to unearth and rename these subterranean histories, which, in spite of and under empire, continue to sprout a multitude of fugitive cosmopoetics. Especially for those of us like me who think from and against a white European perspective, how can we honor these counter-histories when we cannot claim to be completely removed from them, nor wish to paint ourselves as innocent? This chapter, like the rest of this book, is dedicated to staging an encounter between environmental and dance studies, between ecological activism and dance practices. Specifically here, I address questions to practices and theories of touch. What can contact teach us if we task ourselves to survive racial capitalism? The first response to this question might be found in the recent revival of the contact zone concept in the field of environmental studies, where it has been used to describe ecotones, those border zones, thick frontiers that ensure the transition between two ecosystems, for example, between a forest and a prairie. These zones foster biodiversity due to the multiplicity of exchanges and mutual dependencies contracted between the living, who in turn become better equipped to live alongside each other in monolithic spaces. The concept of the ecotone invites us to challenge the idea that communication among the living presupposes the existence of a pre-existing community. To speak of the ecotone is to say that some exchanges take root not in an established community, but rather in a community to come, a community that arises directly out of interaction, a hybridization, the promise of monsters, a mutual disorientation between those who encounter each other on the sidelines of asymmetries of power. As Donna Haraway insists when tackling the question of touch in When Species Meet, an exploration of interspecies relations, quote, "Whom and what do I touch when I touch my dog? How is becoming with a practice of becoming worldly? When species meet, the question of how to inherit histories is pressing, and how to get on together is at stake. Touch does not make one small. It peppers its partners with attachment sites for world making. Touch, regard, looking back, becoming with. All these make us responsible in unpredictable ways for which worlds take shape. Making a troubled or solid commitment to worlds in the making that are neither you nor I, that is the promise of the ecotone. One particular characteristic of ecotones of interest to us inhabitants of Terra trying to survive in the ruins of capitalism is that they possess the quality of being able to function as an ecological refuge. Places where, in the event that either of these mononature cultures entering into contact should collapse, and sometimes they even collapse as a result of this very contact, the species and the modes of existence that have been conceived there will have a chance of survival. In an ecotone, because species live at the limit of where they are used to living, because they exchange materials and knowledge with each other, they create the conditions for survival in the very heart of catastrophe. Quote, "The perverse the queer, the troublesome, unquote, those whom activist poet Gloria Anzaldúa called los atravesados, those who cross over, those who are crossed over, proliferate in these border zones where one never really belongs to any single community of the living, where one lives rather in the underground or in the in-between of communities. Nation-state imperialism typically rendered these border zones inhospitable, making the lives of those who cross genders, species, countries, or continents not only risky but deadly. What happens then when we give a chance to these border spaces, to their inhabitants, and to the refuges they may harbor? Anzaldúa's work provides an answer to these questions through the figure of the mestiza, a creature of ambivalent belongingness, neither entirely welcome where she comes from, nor entirely at home where she is coming to, and yet a figure of the crossing, of the interlocking, a figure inviting peoples to meet. In the same vein, Marunage philosopher Denetem Twambona offers the art of lionnage, the art of interweaving lines of flight as a mobile practice of refusing separation, referring to the lionnage contre profitation, syndicate against profit movement. Twambona's lionnage is a call to ally and rally, bind, connect, and relay everything that was previously unbound. Anticipating the 2018 and 19 French Yellow Vest uprising by nearly a decade, the Caribbean lionnage movement saw an eruption of picket lines, roadblocks, and occupations of roundabouts and public square where, quote, beyond their demands relating to purchasing power and abusive profit, the profitation, massive crowds of people of all ages, all conditions, and all economic sectors found themselves standing together at huge marches, nocturnal gatherings, and enthusiastic vigils, where song, dance, music, free speech, and forgotten warmth and friendliness could freely break out. Unquote. This liane, a Creole word referring both to lianas and to connection and relationships, evokes the power of the forest with which we are allied in every re-existence movement. This is not just a simple metaphor, says Twambona. Liane is a vigorous and vivacious figure representative of the earthly alliance brought into play as soon as we seek to inhabit contact zones. It is a figure wrested from the colonial imaginary, that of confusion and of the jungle only navigable by bulldozer. It is a figure turned against the world of the plantation and its simplified, deadly spaces. The power of lianas, the powers of les liens qui libèrent, ties that liberate, des liens qui délient, ties that unshackle. This is where refuge is built. And you, what are you touching in this instant? The seat of your chair, the ground beneath your feet? What happens in these contact zones, which are neither you nor the world, but a little of both, an effervescent surface flowing with possibilities? Have you already asked yourselves how long you'll need to stay there? How many times you'll have to return there in the hopes that these supposedly distinct entities, you/the world, will contaminate each other? In this chapter, we will explore the ecological, metaphysical, historic, and choreographic ways of thinking about the border spaces between worlds and how the living that inhabit them invite us to overthrow the priority afforded to the individual over the collective. And I will stop there to give some time for Erin to read from their text.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emma. And then we move directly to Erin, if you're ready.
Yeah, that was just so beautiful. I don't really want to deviate. So hopefully we can hold on to those echotones. And what I'm going to do is simply give a sense of what concepts are mobilized in the book that's coming out, Being of Relation. There's a lot of overlap of concern, I think, always between my work and Emma's work. And but just before I go into that, I wanted to say a few words about Fernand de Ligny, who I'm going to be talking about a little bit. The book itself, I think of as a lively encounter between Edouard Glissant and Fernand de Ligny, with a great invigorated environmental conversation between Brian Masumi and Fred Moten. So they're all talking together, and there are lots of other people talking, but I'm particularly interested in what happens when we think through Glissant's concept of difference without separability that Denise Ferrer da Silva also takes up, and others alongside Fernand de Ligny. So I'll just say a few words in case you don't know Fernand de Ligny, Deligny, who is not a figure very known in the Anglophone world. De Ligny was an educator. He was doing very important work in France in the 40s and 50s around so-called delinquents, around the banlieue of Paris and other parts of France. And he ended up at Laborde with Félix Guattari and Jean Houry in the 60s, where he became the director of the journal Recherche. To make things very, very short, Deligny had issues with Laborde. He was particularly concerned with the practices of keeping notes on patients. It was very concerning to him that there was still this arm's length relationship to the patient in the form of a dossier. He was also very interested in autism, and you have to remember that in the 1960s and up until relatively recently, most folks who are autistic would have been called schizophrenic. And the other thing that's important to remember is that the dominant mode of conversation around autism up until the 90s was psychoanalysis, which had enormous repercussions on the question of language. And the book goes into that. But what I really want you to know right now before I read this is that Deligny left Laborde to go to Monoblet in the Cévennes. He spent 30 years there doing extraordinarily interesting experimental work, where he convinced the institutions of France to allow the autistics in their charge to be at Monoblet with him during the summer holidays, when they were in any case charged to leave these institutions. So Deligny is an extraordinary writer and poet, very difficult to translate, which is mostly why he isn't translated, because he reinvents the French language. So it becomes very difficult to translate. For example, in his work, every time you say se, which would usually be se, which means yourself, self, he changes it to ce, which means that. So he's really playing with language in ways that are really fucking difficult to translate. So what I've done in Being of Relation is I've translated passages that I think give you a kind of arc into Deligny's 1700 page sort of documentation. And I will just read briefly the preface. And I've posted it. It's called Errant Lines. And the key concept of Deligny is errant lines. Ligne de fuite. It gets translated in Mille Plateaux as Wanderlines by my partner, Brian Masumi. And I think Wanderlines is fine too. But I like errant lines because it puts us in conversation with Glissant and his concept of errancy. Practices make worlds. The worlds they grow are tangled with pedagogies. When we follow those tendrils of worlds in the making, we are always learning. Sometimes we have a guide. Other times we guide. It's a dance, this guiding, being guided. The guided guiding path takes the shape of the errant line, a concept that grows out of Fernand de Ligny's long co-navigation with autistics in the Monoblet area of France. In deference to other ways of languaging, de Ligny attunes to autistic movement, drawing the shape of its expression. These errant lines become tracings which, in palimpsest, index tendencies. Zones of intensity emerge, which he calls chevêtres. Chevêtres, as de Ligny defines them, are less the trusses of existence, so the English translation of chevêtres is truss, are less the trusses of existence than the reminder that the shape things take matters. This is not about form per se, it's about the trace the shape of experience leaves behind, how it whirls. So the tracings that were made at Monoblet were tracings of movement, of autistic movement. Another way of saying this is that errant lines are not without direction. They have momentum, and they are made of constraints. They emerge in the decisiveness of a context, in a situation. In this way, they are both absolutely singular and they carry the inheritances of worlds already in the making. A Poetics of Relation, to write with Edouard Glissant, is a commitment to the erring that guides and detours existence. Errant lines cannot be thought without it. Relation is what errs, not me or you. Being of relation is guided by a Poetics of Relation. It is punctuated twice by Chevêtres of Glissant's Poetics of Relation, two short interludes, Black Beach and When You Fall. These chevêtres might be said to carry the approximation of proximity of Black life and neurodiversity that never stops resurfacing. I can talk more about the neurodiversity in Poetics of Relation if you're interested. A Poetics of Relation is a practice. It draws errant lines. Parastrata emerge, thicknesses, overlaps, sidelings, echotones. These can't properly be excavated as though there were a beginning and an end. Relation, the radical empirical middle from which experience unfolds, refuses to segregate objects from activity. Objects, subjects, are the activity of their worlding. Subjectivity is produced. The logic of the para-institutional, para-ontological, para-pedagogical, is a logic of what Brian Masumi would call mutual inclusion. In its difference without separability, the para takes us beyond binary structures of cause and effect into fields of resonance, of alongsideness. Para is not against. It is in the witness of what is differentially singular. The differentially singular in a Poetics of Relation upsets mutually exclusive logics that justify dominant systems. It troubles whiteness and neurotypicality. It does so not through a frontal attack, but by moving sideways. This is not to suggest that lives aren't at stake. It is to remind us that any inclination to do it alone, to say I and mean we, is embedded in a logic, in a systemic operation that can only retain the status quo. A Poetics of Relation moves otherwise, and in the aesthetics of the earth it calls forth to speak with Glissant again, other worlds become possible. Other worlds never means worlds over there. Other worlds are here, in the middling, always. Relation is not between two and never at a distance. It is not what is stuck between two terms, the in-between of what we already think we know. Relation is world. Being of relation is the para-ontological register of a becoming world. And I just pause here to say that the para-ontological comes from name Chandler and is dedicated to the work of Du Bois, who talks about race as that which exceeds the thought of ontology. Para-ontology recognizes that the ontological could only ever speak the I, and that the I could only ever take the shape of exclusion. I is white. White is colonial. It is not reducible to skin, though the whiteness of skin does sidle it, and that's always something worth keeping in mind. An aesthetics of the earth is black. Think errant line. Blackness here does not limit itself to naming a person. I, after all, excludes. Blackness is the weather, the sociality of all that is para to ontology, of all that seeks another logic, indifference without separability. That Black people have singular ways of living that weather is incontestable. If there is an argument in the being of relation, it is that Blackness cannot be captured. This isn't to say that whiteness is not in every moment working to colonize it, to tone it down, to sequester it, to make it say I, in, to cite Saidiya Hartman, the burdened individuality of freedom. Blackness cannot be captured because each chevêtre, poetic of relation, crafts, holds the world together differently. The violence is not to be underestimated, however. To say that whiteness cannot be reduced to skin is to recognize that it is everywhere at work, in the logics that hold up systems we have come to identify, whoever we are, as common sense. De Ligny's commitment to other ways of tracing may be a guide for this, but only insofar as tracing remains a practice, not an end in itself. If tracing languages, it does so in ecologies that hear in red, see in wet. It asks, what is a language that doesn't begin in I and that refuses to sit still? In the echo of an errant reading, deeply indebted to a process philosophical ethos, Being of Relation aims to practice the opacity that is a poetics of relation, wandering into language's excess, into the conceptual folds it leaves behind, languaging at the cusp, in the approximation of proximity, of neurodiversity, and Black life. And I want to say that languaging here is a concept from Adam Wolfond, who's an autistic who communicates with a device. Whiteness is there, policing the cleave, neurotypicality always at the ready, but errancy is a potent deviator. Being of Relation airs us toward new paths. Parapedagogies of resistance are at the ready to welcome the wandering. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both Erin and Emma for the wonderful readings. Thank you again.